Hi, Susan. So excited to have you here on Lead Time Chats today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk with you. It's been a while.
Yeah, and I am very excited about the juicy topic we have today, which is really how do you navigate conflict on distributed teams? And I know you're an experienced leadership consultant and executive coach, so I'm sure you've been hearing a lot from different people in different companies of how conflict is arising, how is it different? So I guess maybe to start us off, what have you been hearing or observing on teams?
Yeah, it's super interesting. So when in the pandemic, I think about like there was a change in things when the pandemic started and we all suddenly went remote. Almost everybody was 100% remote at that point. And I noticed a big change. It's not like I was surprised, but I also wasn't looking for a change in conflict necessarily. It wasn't something I thought, oh, there's going to be conflict is going to change. But what I noticed was instead of we might think of conflict as like hot conflict where we're like at each other's throats or like it's obvious, or open conflict where like, oh, those two do not get along. What I noticed was more conflict avoidance. So that like part of what happened was our established patterns began to break down. And, so for example, I've talked to leaders and what I noticed happening was issues were lingering longer and longer and longer and longer. So issues of we're disagreeing, performance issues, which I know we don't like to talk about that, but they happen. Yeah. And what I noticed was, well, so what happened? Why is this issue really lingering? And I think a lot of it was because some of the things broke down, right? Some of their normal habits. So someone said to me, well, when I had to have a hard conversation, what would happen is I would just go say, hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee. And then as we're grabbing our coffee and we're walking, we're going to have a conversation. And just having a cup of coffee and something to sip on and to walk and make it casual made it less stressful.
Yeah. And you're walking side by side. You're not just like staring at each other over Zoom, right? Like, well, why'd you call this meeting? Right? Like, let's get to it.
Right. Like, can we talk? The dreaded words, right? Like, we need to have a conversation. You're like, what? And God forbid it's on a Friday, it's like, strikes fear into our heart. So I think that really changed a lot of people. Also, I noticed my folks who were already remote, let's say they were already distributed, and let's say maybe there was like an HQ, right? There was a headquarters. They were no longer able to travel to it, and they realized how much, even once a quarter, how much that really built those relationships. So there was a lot more trust in those relationships, and hard conversations were much harder when they didn't have those, when they felt like the ties were loosening.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to something really important, which is like, it's not just about how do you have this conversation that is uncomfortable and touches on conflict. It's like, how do you do the initial kind of building of the foundation of a high trust relationship so that you can have those conversations, and it's not like, can we talk is like, oh no, something's wrong, right? Like
something's
that
terribly
you're talking
wrong
regularly, right?
Yeah. And I think also, it is a lot about that trust. Plus, then what's happened is, the Great Resignation, right? So the Great Resignation, lots of people have left, which also means lots of new people have come in, and we have not, maybe like now things are changing, but in the last 2 years, we haven't met people in person at all. So it's easier in a way to sort of, we don't have that trust with people. The ties are looser. We don't really know.
Yeah.
When we don't know how that conversation's going to go, right?
Right.
Like, how is a hard conversation going to go?
Right. With someone you've been working with for a few years, you kind of have, you kind of adjusted to how each other communicate. And when you're talking about performance too, one thought that came up for me was like, it's also, remote aside, I think it's also just been a particularly difficult time to have those conversations because, people have like, not so much anymore, but like earlier in the pandemic, I had like kids distance learning, like at home, and, people were just, almost everyone I knew was struggling with like burnout, with like life stuff, anxiety, right? Like mental health. And like, it feels like as a manager, it feels like, oh, I don't know what is appropriate here, right? Like how much slack, what are the expectations, right? Like that sort of conflict of like, are people meeting expectations? Like, well, we're in a pandemic for the first time in our lives. Like, should they even be meeting expectations, right? Like, what are the expectations?
Well, right. And at what point do we say, oh, this is actually a problem, and I, how much slack do we give? How much do we not give? I think
Right.
it's a huge issue in a pandemic when we aren't face to face. And I think companies are going to be facing this continually too, because some companies are going back, but not everyone will. I think we'll see many more companies being remote. I'm not sure, I wonder what you think. Do you think that that's true too, or do you have a different perspective?
It kind of went back and forth. Like towards the beginning, I was like, oh, everyone's going to be remote. And then now it seems like a lot of companies are going back in office. But I think what is true is that people who want to work remote will be able to find remote jobs. And people who want to work in office will be able to find in office jobs, whereas before, people who wanted to work remote, it felt like, okay, there's like these 5 companies and like, whether or not they're hiring depends on, time of year or whatever, but it just felt like there weren't as many options to choose from. And now I feel like there's a ton.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think more hybrid situations too, where people are in office sometimes, at home. Yeah.
I've noticed people moving, like, people willing to make longer commute if they're only having to be in office 2 days a week rather than like 5 days, right? Like, and I could see, I definitely would not want to go back to working 5 days in office and commuting, an hour each way, but 2 days is like not so bad. But, so in terms of conflict, so you talked about like, it was not so much the kind of like, hard butting, like, intense conflict that you're seeing, but it's more conflict avoidance around like performance or, disagreement. What other sorts of conflict have you seen show up?
Well, and it's even not just, I want to make sure it's not just about performance, but it's like, as a team, sometimes we end up having like pleasant conversation, and we're not really digging down into, how do we disagree with each other, and how do we disagree so we can surface our assumptions, so we can, surface where do we disagree, what's the right decision, what are all the different opinions around it. So it's not even just around performance, but we're just having pleasant conversations, I think, because we're not sure maybe how to disagree with each other, and we're getting more conflict avoidant again, pardon me, partially because of those looser ties, and maybe we're like, how do I have conflict when I'm almost only over Zoom?
Because I can imagine in an in-person office, right? You might get in a conference room, go deep on some topic, have some disagreements, and then afterwards you still see the people, and you can kind of get a gauge of like, hey, are we okay? Like you kind of get that like that casual
hey, want some coffee?
sense of like, oh, hey, like, oh, this person's not like really upset at me because we had this conversation. Like we're still in a good place. And I think on Zoom, it's a little bit harder because then you leave the meeting, and then your only really synchronous interactions tend to be in these really structured, well, I guess hopefully structured, depending on your company, right? Like these meetings where you're talking about work. And so, I'm curious if you found if people you work with have found ways to like build maybe more casual interactions, or build some of that layer throughout.
I think it's really important too, because it's like what we get to is like artificial harmony, right? And artificial harmony is terrible for us. So how do we get around artificial harmony so we can dig down into it? And I think part of it is, honestly, it's something that I take from coaching, which is designing the relationship. So how are we talking with each other about things? Okay, so I call it talking about the talking. Like, so how do you feel about conflict? What happens when conflict shows up? What happens when we disagree? How do you tend to handle that? How do I, here's how I handle that. Being much more conscious about our relationship and how we interact with each other, and not just the goals that have to get done, not just the objectives. Like, well, how should we handle it when we disagree? You know, how do we want to handle mistakes? How do you best like to be supported, to be supported? And I think we can also do these at the team level too. The team can talk about, how do we handle it when we disagree? What's the way that we're going to process that? What's the way that we're going to handle mistakes? Because I think what happens is we think conflict is bad a lot of times, right? I say the word conflict and everyone's like, I said it a couple of weeks ago at Lead Dev. I was doing, did 2 workshops for leaders there. When I said the word conflict, you could just feel the room contract. And I think that's actually part of like the roadblock, right?
Yeah.
That contraction, even I'm doing it myself as I feel that word. It's like, I think we also have to normalize that disagreement is normal. Disagreement is okay. In any relationship, we're going to disagree. You and I are in a relationship right now as we talk. We may or may not agree on things. That's okay. It's like, how do we want to be with disagreement, and knowing that it's part of the relationship? It's like how we handle it that matters more.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about, it makes me think that like maybe the remote and the Zoom meetings and the remote team setup makes it easier for people who are maybe naturally a bit more conflict avoidant to not have the hard conversations. And so it sounds like, I mean, I could imagine, when something comes up, say we're in a meeting, we disagree, even in that moment, if we haven't had any conversations beforehand about how we want to handle conflict, one of us could be like, hey, this is great. Like, it's good. So good. We're having this conversation right now. How do we want to handle when we disagree? Right. You could kind of zoom out at that point and have that conversation, but you could also, right, as you were saying, design it up front, right? Like with the people you're managing or people that you're working with, of like, especially with around giving feedback. Like I've told people like, how do they like to receive feedback? And we've had agreements of like, great, like I won't hold back any feedback, right? Like as soon as I know something, I have some feedback to give you, like my intention is to share it with you as soon as possible. And people have been like, great, like that's so good to know, right? Like then you just don't know that the other person's not like holding on to something and like avoiding this uncomfortable conversation. And I know that they want it, right? Like you kind of have the agreement up front before the conflict. But either way, I could see going, like you could take either approach if you haven't had that conversation beforehand.
Well, right, because what happens is it gets really awkward, and we're like, do I say it? Do I not say it? And then how much energy does that take in your head? And when we're avoiding conflict or we're being nice, I'm just gonna be nice and agree. And by the way, people who typically start conflict might also be pulling themselves back, and I shouldn't even say start conflict, but surface contact. Like they surface the conflict so that we can begin to address them. But I think what happens is when we sort of recede away from it, we end up having the conflict in our head. And how much energy does that take? And then, by the way, eventually, if we have the conflict in our head over and over and over again, where we're giving slack and we're just talking about it inside our head because we're trying to play nice because we're on Zoom and we don't really know, and is there time to disagree, and there's goals. Eventually what happens is we can't hold on to it anymore, and maybe we do lash out at people.
So like really weighs you down over time. I was thinking like maybe what we could do is think of some tips for how to, because I feel like people you kind of feel when you have something that's unsaid, right? But I think people don't necessarily know how to get into it. And when you were saying like, oh, it feels really awkward, I was just thinking that's something you can say, right? Like, hey, I feel like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit awkward because I need to talk to you about something. And like, are you open to having the conversation or hearing some feedback? And like, because they can tell you're being awkward, whether or not you say it. Like everyone can tell, right? And so even just like naming what's there can be really helpful. I'm curious if you have any other like tips for entering, conflict, or just having conversations that need to be had.
Yeah, like I always think about them as like hard conversations. Like, and it's hard. Why is it hard? For a variety of reasons. And sometimes it's hard because we feel uncomfortable. And I love, by the way, naming it is such a powerful thing. Just name. I feel awkward. I'm feeling vulnerable. This, I don't know what to say, can sometimes be so wonderful because it helps make us be human. And that can remind us, oh yes, we're we're human. I think, one of the ways, this might sound funky, but one of the ways to enter it is to think about managing our own emotions. Like, how are we managing our emotions when it comes to conflict? Right. Again, it goes back to that emotional response that we all have. And, people talk about fight, flight, or freeze, but there's also fawn. Right. So fawn, I don't know if it's one of the ones they've more recently talked about, but fawn is like where, let's say, if we get into conflict, I might try to please the other person and, I'll take responsibility or apologize. One down. I used to be a freezer and a fawner. I know these things. So but I recognized, so am I, I think part of it is recognizing when it feels awkward, when it feels like we might have open conflict licking at our heels. Do we recognize what's happening inside of us? And do we think about, managing our emotions and thinking about, I take this, what might be a different approach, So it's like a lot of it is managing our emotions. Now, listen, that's hard because a lot of people have wall-to-wall meetings, especially now that we're remote and on Zoom, people have wall-to-wall meetings. And so we have to find time and space to build in the reflection so that we can notice what's going on inside of ourselves.
Yeah. I like the default reaction for a lot of people is like, ugh, conflict, uncomfortable, hard. Like, I don't want to be there. I want to avoid it. The reframing and the reflection of like, ooh, there's something juicy here. Like, I want to get curious about that so that, because if you sense some disagreement and you're about to embark on like a 2-month project, right? Like, that's great that you're sensing that there's disagreement, because that needs to get hammered out like ASAP before
it shows
2
the gap
months in, right? Like, yeah. So
right.
seeing that internal, it's almost like a little, a sensor you have inside of you that's like, ooh, like something's not aligned. And so seeing it as, I guess, more of a sensor, like that there's something there to be curious about and then figure out what to do with it.
Right. It's like, I always think of it as, it's like it's a mindset shift, right? It's a reframe on conflict is bad to, what do I notice here? What's going on? And like, show us, here's the gap between where we are and how we're perceiving things. And like you said, getting to that earlier in the project, rather than we're far down the pipe and now we're really frustrated. And you ever been there when someone's like, I knew we should have done it this way. And you're like,
why didn't you say something?
Why am I hearing about this 2 months in?
Right.
How frustrating is that when we think, well, that's actually a great idea. I want to hear about that sooner.
Yeah. And not to say that you're going to be like thrilled to feel that, right? Like, it's still going to be uncomfortable and like, oh, now I have to go have this conversation, but just not seeing it purely as, something to avoid. But I guess that example is more like, it's less personal. It's like, oh, maybe we have a disagreement about how an implementation should go or something like that. What about like when people on your team or people working with each other, their personalities or their like communication styles are clashing and there's conflict there? Have you found ways to I guess those are things that feel like they could linger a bit more in a remote setting just because of the more limited like synchronous interactions. Any tips there?
Yeah. I think it's a really, God, I'm so sorry. Excuse me.
No problem.
Allergies. And I have a blooming tree right out in front of me. So, and it is blooming today. So I think it's a really good point too, because I think there's like reasons, like what are our reasons for conflict? And I think style is a really big one. And again, I sound like maybe like a broken record, but for me, when I'll hear people I'm like, well, did you talk to them about that? Have you talked about how the two of you are disagreeing? Rather than what do? We make them wrong, or like, they're so frustrating and they don't know how to do it. Or we call people incompetent sometimes when we don't agree with their style. They may or may not be incompetent, but often what I find is that we're not actually having the conversation between the two of us. So many times when I hear people talking about that, it's always encouraging them to go back to talk to each other and have that real conversation. Like, hey, I think we might have different ways of going about this. And, I don't know that I know your way. Here's my way. Or I want to figure out how we can work through it together. Again, it's like being vulnerable and human. And again, I think what happens is we shy away from it. We don't want to talk about it, but it's like naming the thing that's in the room. It's the elephant. And we're like, the elephant is crowding us out, which is the thing that's unsaid. And now until we can barely interact with each other. And I think what happens again is we're having an argument in our head, and then we begin to make the other person wrong, or we make ourselves wrong. Yeah. And then we like try to change, but like changing the way that you interact and your style, your natural style, assuming it's in healthy expression, that's really hard. Yeah. So it is really about like, go right to it rather than going through. I think a lot of times we pick intermediaries, right? Like, let's just cut out the middle person.
Right. Yeah. The sense I like when two people are in conflict, I feel like the sense of relief when someone names it and it's like, and not in a like, what you're doing, you're obviously doing this wrong, right? Like your communication style is wrong, but just like acknowledging that like, I'm going about it this way. It seems like you're going about it this way. And I think this is where this like tension or conflict is coming from. Like, can we talk about that? Like, then you can actually talk about it instead of just like, holding it and being resentful. But in fact, I feel like what's easier for people is to complain, right? Complain to the intermediary, but then it's like, then that really tends to deteriorate trust. I mean, there are situations, of course, to bring in another person, but if you haven't tried to talk to each other first, I feel like then it's like, well, why didn't you talk to me? Right now you're complaining to my manager, and now they, who knows what you told them. And then people feel like they need to defend themselves, and that like, I think they've called it like the feedback triangle. It's like, no, big no, right? Like cut that other person out. And so as a manager to coach people to do, as you said, right? Like go to the person, talk about how you want to work together, what's important.
Well, right too, because I think about, I never know how to say Anise Nin. She said, we don't see things the way they are. We see them the way we are. And so when we go to an intermediary, we're giving a perspective about this. This is from ours, but it's not the truth. It's our perspective. And there may be lots of different perspectives. And because we're in our fear, our frustration, we can get dug in and actually miss other things and misattribute like, oh, they mean bad. They're trying to hurt me. They're trying to control me, when in fact the other person might just be trying to be a human, trying to figure out how to interact with someone who's really different. So I think that's another reason why going directly to the source is so important and can resolve it faster, to your point.
What are some, I know you coach a lot of leaders, like I feel like a team's kind of comfort with conflict and hard conversations kind of comes from the top. And so maybe to end, is there a tip or, any sort of tactical advice you would give to leaders about building a culture of like healthy conflict and disagreement?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a great point, because I agree. Leaders run that. No matter how much we want to have flat orgs, bottom up, all of that, leaders have an outside impact. It's just reality. I think the leader plays an incredibly important role, which is how willing are you to be vulnerable, to say, oh, I made a mistake, or I was wrong. How much are you modeling that to other people, that it's okay to disagree with me? It's okay in a meeting to say, I'm not sure I agree, or wow, I have a different perspective on that, and figuring out ways to invite that so that you can model it in the team right there, showing that you are a human too. And that again, modeling disagreement, conflict, tension, it's all okay. That friction There's nothing wrong with that friction. It just means there's something underneath the surface we have to get to. But I do think modeling it and you being as open as you possibly can is really important way that you can create that culture. Or when you notice two people disagreeing, saying, I notice we disagree about this. Let's talk about this as a group. Let's say you're in a team meeting. You could say, oh, I noticed there's emerging opinions here. Let's talk about it. Rather than going to like, oh, someone's right or someone's wrong, or let's talk about that later. Let's take it offline, you know?
Like, ooh, uncomfortable. Take it offline.
Like, how do we be with discomfort, right?
Yeah. I think, and as a leader too, I think it is important to model to acknowledge that you're imperfect, right? Your ideas are imperfect, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like someone comes and they're like, I disagree. And you're like, great, I want to hear your idea. It could just be even like presenting stuff in progress and being like, what am I missing? Right. Like sharing docs that have like, a kind of rough broad strokes proposal, and then having space at the bottom that's like, hey, what am I missing? What came up for you that maybe this didn't address? Just like inviting that before it's like, kind of like conflict, right? What people think of as like a disagreement or conflict.
Yeah, I'll often say to people, listen, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I don't think I have all the best ideas. I really want to hear from you and make my ideas better. It's just really, and saying those things over and over and over and over again, so that they really get the point that we're here to make things better. It's not about egos. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about how do we work better together and how do we get to the best outcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Suzan. I think this will be helpful for leaders and anyone who's really, holding stuff that, kind of shifting how they think about the stuff that they hold and how they interact with other people.
Yeah, thanks so much. I had such a great time.